We're the unseen, the unheard, the unspoken of the world. We live among you, but you got to look to find us. I'm going to give you a little overview. In the 2013 Global Status Evangelism Stats, it says that there's about 300 to 500 million deaf and hard of hearing people in this world. Now let me explain what deaf and hard of hearing means. These are people who have difficulty communicating because of a hearing loss or maybe a speech impediment all around the world. If you took it all together in one place and took all the deaf people, we'd be the fourth largest country in the world after the United States. In there are 300 to 35 million people in the world. 30 to 35 million people in the world that are culturally deaf people. In the video that you saw, those would all be labeled culturally deaf people because they identify with a specific people, culture, and language around the world. One culture is not the same as another culture. But in this video that we showed you, we all share something that's common. And it's that we're all deaf. And so that's what connects us together in the deaf world, global. That's our identity. Now here, you notice this is kind of a different map. Let's look at this again. Hold on, I want you to compare it. Do you see the difference? Do you see anything there? All the statistics that are there, we can't give you specific numbers about the deaf. Why? Because the deaf people group, they're dispersed all over the world. There's no exact statistic that we can show for how many there are. Most culturally deaf people live in China and in India. Altogether, there's 167 unreached people groups. There's 167 unreached people groups in the deaf. Let me make this more simpler terms for you. Hold on one moment. Only 2% of culturally deaf people know and have a relationship with Jesus Christ as their personal Savior and Lord. Out of 30 million people, only 2%. That number, 2%, that's the exact same number of Muslims and Hindus who also know Christ. And one more thing to add. Roughly every day, about 750 deaf people die without knowing Christ. Every day. This map, it also shows you something else that's in common about deaf ministry. It's called diaspora. You know, there's a big number of people, but it's hard to find out where they are. There are different cultures and different languages, and when you go into a specific culture, like for example in America or in China or in Russia, there's going to be deaf people there. But to go and find them and locate them and know how many there are, like for example in America, you know, we've got American Sign Language. That's what I'm using right now. But it doesn't apply in all the other different languages. Sign language is not the same. So typically, deaf people are the last people to know something. They're the least included people group. This story was my story, really. I was born and I was raised in a hearing family. I was the only one that's deaf in my family. I went deaf at a month. And I really never connected with the deaf culture. My parents, they wanted to have a relationship with their kids. They wanted to have a relationship with me. So they decided to learn sign language so that they'd be able to communicate with me. And they put me into a deaf school, a residential school for the deaf, so I could get educated with people who sign and use sign language. And also, I had the privilege and the opportunity to go to a deaf church. Before I went to the deaf church, I would show up and I'd attend a hearing church, same as the hearing churches that you're serving in, where your pastor is talking and speaking, and I have no idea what you're saying. When I was growing up, the pastor, he was representative of God to me. But I couldn't connect with him. I had no idea how to connect with him because I couldn't talk with him. There was no way to do that. It was impossible. And so if he didn't learn how to sign, I would feel very, he would often feel nervous when he would come and talk to me. And so I thought, that's what I think about God. If I can't relate with the pastor, it means I can't relate with God. God only spoke a spoken language. But by his grace, he made an opportunity in my life that the pastor could use sign language, was hearing, and he could sign as well. Because of that pastor, God meant something to me. I started going to the deaf church, and then I became to know the Lord. But I'm in that 2% of people. The diaspora, that's a representative of a crisis for us in deaf ministry. I'm going to give you a brief history. In America, the hard of hearing in America typically, I'm talking specifically about hard of hearing. In the 1960s and the 1970s, they had great deaf ministries here, big churches. They had good ministry. Hearing people were committed to helping deaf people. They were getting involved. They were supporting the deaf culture. That generation was one of the most highly educated generations related with the Bible. But today, in 2014, there's a crisis right now. That generation of the 60s and 70s, right now, they're not in church. And deaf churches are dwindling and they're dying. Many of them have asked, where are the youth? Where are the young people? Where are they? When we used to go to church, but now they don't. What happened? Let me explain what happened in that 40 or 50 year time frame. There were 5 kind of crises that developed in deaf culture in America. The first one was a cultural crisis of culture. Is medical versus the ethno-linguistic perspective. Many hospitals out there said, oh, your child is deaf. That's a problem. They're limited. They've got, this is a human problem, a physical impossibility. What do we need to do? We need to do something surgical. We need to put cochlear implants. We need to give them to speech therapists. We need to teach them how to talk. And didn't realize that they were part of a special culture with an identity. But the ethno-linguistic side said, no, wait a minute. Okay, so they're deaf, that's okay. He can't speak and hear, but being deaf is okay. I'm a member of a greater community, of the deaf community, and I'm not sorry about that. I'm not ashamed about who I am. Like on the videotape, you saw those people. They're very proud of their deaf culture. They have strong identities of who they are as deaf people in the world. But the medical perspective is like, oh, that's a bad thing. We got to fix deafness. We can't have that. The result is that you've got more diaspora. And also you've got a crisis of language as well. You've got the oralism versus bilingualism. Many people in the past, they wanted to do something called at the Council of Milan, thank you. In the Council of Milan, there was a lot of educators there and deaf people came, and they said, we have to support oralism. That's the best method for learning. And ever since that time, oralism was how people were going to educate. That's how you were going to learn to be educated, is through speech. Not through sign language, not through culture, through speaking. And that they expected deaf people to learn how to speak and understand what they were saying. compared to the emphasis on bilingualism, those people recognized that deaf people could learn through sign language, through a visual language. Plus, they could also learn English, French, Russian, both. They could learn them at the same time concurrently. And both of those camps, both of those approaches led to a crisis of relationship. The relationship, it's kind of compared to residential and mainstream. Okay, a mainstream perspective, it emphasizes oralism and interpreters and uses interpreters, and the relationships are limited because all you have is the interpreter. You could be one deaf student in an entire school with an interpreter. And my parents said, you know, the deaf school is going to provide him an education as well. And some people will say that the mainstream schools provide a better education. But in this situation, there's less opportunity in the mainstream system to develop an identity of who they are as a deaf person and a deaf individual, as opposed to they wouldn't know who their identity was because they wouldn't have the relationships with the deaf culture and the deaf community. If you're in a residential school for the deaf, before the 60s, they emphasized residential schools for deaf people. And you would go and you would live in the dorms, and that was normal. You would go to the schools and live there. You would eat there, and you would shower there, and you know, you play together. And the result of that was it developed a strong sense of community in the residential schools, and they had a strong sense of relationship. And also the parents' involvement, the parents were involved is another relational situation. And let me give you some numbers, for example, for you to think about. 90% of all deaf children are born to hearing families. Okay? 90% of all deaf children are born to hearing families. Of that 90%, only 10% of the families will learn sign language. My parents, they're one of those 10%, and I thank the Lord for that, because I can have a relationship with my parents. Wait, who?
Helen Keller.
Oh, Helen Keller. Sorry. Helen Keller wrote, she said, blindness separates people from things, but deafness separates people from each other. And because of that separation, now we can't relate with someone because we can't communicate with them, and that's going to impact our relationship with God. We feel like we can't communicate with God until we can make a connection with someone here that can communicate with us. If God is only speaking your language, then that's what you want. This led to a crisis of community. You know, deafness has an identity. There's an identity there, and it's your identity versus isolation. There was a lot of identity development and formation through the residential school programs and things of that nature. There were deaf clubs. They had fun things to do together. There was activities. There was a strong deaf identification because of the communication. But you get a mainstream child who's the only deaf person in there, and now you've got oralism, and there's a less, it's more of an isolation situation there for that child, because that deaf person never meets anyone who's deaf, who understands their life. And then they go to college, and some never learn sign language until they get to college. For example, Gallaudet University in Washington, D.C. is one of the only deaf universities in the world to offer degrees. Around the entire world, it's the only deaf university. And on April 8th, it's the 150th year of the charter of Gallaudet University in 1864. To let people become, so that we would have higher education specifically for deaf people. Gallaudet University is the only school that has that is completely focused on deaf people around the whole world to date. So because of an identity versus isolation crisis, a lot of people in the world grew up, not so much here, but in other parts of the country, they view deafness as a second-class citizen. Maybe,
In India,
well, especially in India.
they're considered untouchable.
They're untouchable in India, thank you. They can't own their own businesses. Some of them can't even work. They can't even get permits to work. It's against the law. They want to start their own businesses. They could. They have the ability, but they've got limitation of the government, and so they can't. And also here in America, it's more and more prevalence of, it's like wait, back up.
Entitlement.
Sorry, an entitlement issue. If there's an entitlement mindset, it's something like a pastor in ministry or a leader will say, well, how many deaf people are getting SSI, Social Security income? How many people are getting that? About 80% of people here in America are getting Social Security income. And because of that, there's like a reduced sense of self-identity and pride and self-esteem. Like the government has to take care of me, so I don't have to work. And so then when they go to church, sometimes they feel like, you know, what am I doing here? Why should I give? I barely have enough money. I can't give tithes. I'm barely making ends meet with what I'm getting off of Social Security. So it affects the church and the faith community here as well in America because of the entitlement mindset. You don't really find that in any other, you can find it in other countries, sometimes more, sometimes less, depending on what country you're in. And the last crisis that I want to talk about is a crisis of faith. Sometimes they can compare it to like Christianity versus like the deaf worldism. You know, like here in seminary, you know, we like to make up words. You know, the professors make up words here, so I'm making up my own word today. So deaf worldism is my word. Chris is going to explain more from his perspective, but I just wanted to make a point right now, and that is the top priority of any church should be to make disciples, right? Disciples of Christ. That's the top priority. And it's the same with the deaf church. We want to develop deaf people to make deaf disciples. But with our deaf churches right now, we're not producing deaf disciples. And that's our crisis here. A lot of deaf churches, you'll have a pastor there, and they're suffering from isolation. They're suffering from burnout. Maybe there are various reasons why they don't have support there. Maybe it's not just financial. Maybe they can't afford it. Maybe their theology and their theological training isn't strong, or some of them can't even potentially read. So really, I mean, I'm just touching on all 5 of these crises that I've given you. Now really, I could take 5 days to talk about each of them. We can have a ministry conference for each of the things that I've just titled and just listed out for you. But right now, I want to give you an overview. And I want you to focus on the importance of deaf ministry here, deaf missions here. If you've got any questions about any of these 5 crises that I've listed, afterwards I'll give you the opportunity after we speak. We can have a Q&A time. But right now I would like to lend the floor over to Chris Corson, who himself, he has been with the IMB, and he has worked. You might have seen him before because he's worked as an interpreter here often with me. But he has been a pastor in a missionary church for several years. For 29 years, right? 29 years. And he's going to bring a unique perspective for us today on working with deaf as a hearing person, as a hearing pastor. And the reason why I wanted to do that is because I think his knowledge could help benefit you, especially as seminarians. He graduated from seminary as well, so he's a seminarian too. Chris?
As Bruce mentioned earlier, one of the things that we've got to look at as a church, if we're going to be effective in reaching the deaf community and the deaf world, we've got 30 million deaf people worldwide. And so in that, as Bruce has already kind of explained, you've got these 4 different areas that kind of build up any kind of ethno-linguistic group. And so you've got your language. Very clear. When you see a deaf person, that's how you usually recognize a deaf person is because they're signing. Part of the problem, though, is hearing people, typically this is the only thing that we think of because that's the only thing that we can see. There's a language difference. There's a sign language. And back in the 40s, 50s, hearing people started looking at that and said, well, this is not a language, it's just a gesture. It's just kind of a made-up way to communicate. But through the 70s and the 80s, there's been a lot of research done that showed that it's an actual language that has its own structure, it has its own form. Oftentimes, if you read a deaf person's writing, you'll look at that and say, I have no clue as what they're writing. Part of that is the education aspect of being in a program which didn't teach them a good foundation in the English language. But oftentimes, when they either speak orally or they're writing in a format that's falls in line with their language and their syntax and their grammar. And so sometimes you've got a good education program, opportunities have been provided, and they're bilingual. They have a good command of the English language and also the sign language. But this is the one that we always focus on typically. Your social interaction, your political structure, how they do things, how they interact with one another, how they choose a leader, how they make decisions. That's what the political structure is. And the educational identity. Bruce has done a great job explaining about how that residential thing, that's one of the things that has really impacted deaf churches and deaf work in our modern time, the last probably 20 years, is that residential program is getting less. Today, in the deaf core, and this is this 30 million. I mean, out here is your 300 million people, but this deaf core group, this cultural group, that's the 30 million that we're addressing. Again, ethno-linguistic. The name of it slips me right now, but the ethnologue. It was only about 10 years ago that they finally decided that people were considered as a people group. And so the only thing is, it's a people group that typically you're not born into. It is something that they share common language is different, but a lot of their shared experiences are very similar. What I want to do this morning is bring a case study about Moscow, Russia. 2002, my family and I moved to Russia. We were appointed by the International Mission Board. We went in there, and our purpose was to begin deaf churches. And even before we moved there, we had a Russian pastor in another city who said, don't go to Moscow. Moscow's a black hole. You will not have any effective there. The spirit is dead there. It's not moving. Go somewhere else. It'll be a black hole, and it will swallow you whole, ministry-wise and any other way. But we prayed, and that's where we felt the Lord was calling us to go to. To be light where there wasn't any light. Kind of the history of the fall of communism in 1990. From 90 to 92, there was absolutely no work among the deaf. We had all the Western mission groups going in and evangelizing hearing people, but we really didn't have any kind of an effective way of coming in and evangelizing the deaf community. I remember in 1985, at the Deaf World Olympics, the deaf did not come to it was before 1985. This was circa 1980-81. I met a deaf couple at the Statue of Liberty who were here on holiday, and they were touring, and we ran into them. And we tried to communicate. We were able to communicate, on a very, basic level. But when we were trying to talk about God and everything, they didn't have a clue. We were talking about the cross. Cross, yeah, building. That was their total concept about it. And so anyway, from 1992, while the hearing Russians were being evangelized and being won to the Lord, deaf people weren't. It was finally about 1992 when you had your first ministries beginning, and that was in Moscow. Moscow is the oldest ministry in the Central Baptist Church there among deaf work in Russia. And then most of the others started beginning within the next year or two. Several of the other cities began their deaf ministry at that time as well. This is very interesting because from 92 to 97, they went from 0 to an average of 300 deaf people at the Central Church in Moscow. On a weekly basis, they had around 300 deaf people attending. What happened next, though, over the next 4 years, 97 to 2000, they went from 300 to 30. From 2000 to 2004, that's about what they maintained, was about 30 deaf people in that ministry. When we got on the scene, we got on the scene in 2002, had language study. We were finally released from ministry in 2004. 2004 was the first church that we began in our living room. Now, all these people, we had 2 from America who just happened to be in Moscow at that time. They were former members of a church I pastored. They were there. But we basically started with 4 adults. Valera, who eventually became the pastor of the church, his wife, their 3 kids are all deaf, and then Pavel and his wife and his daughter. So that very first Sunday, we only had 8 adults, and 4 of us were foreigners. So we had 4 adults that first Sunday. Now, we had been told it was very difficult to do church work in Russia. It was very slow growth in Russia at this time. We've been told that Russia and Moscow is the black hole. Spirit of God's not moving there. This is what happened from the fall of 2004, September 2004. 2 months later, at this time we had 4 people, adults. November we had 30 coming on a regular basis in our little apartment, and they would stay from 12 o'clock until 6 or 7 o'clock at night. By the fall of 2005, in 1 year's time, we had an average of 80 every Sunday, with high attendance at times being 130 people. Not in our living room. We had to move it somewhere else at this time. Out of those 80, only about 20% of those 80 were actually believers. There was a hunger there. They were wanting to know. For years they had been told there's no such thing as God. And yet they saw in some of their deaf friends some of the things that were happening, and they were curious. And so they came. And it was very interesting because that church that we began, from day one, we had a deaf person who served as the pastor of that group. We always intended to be behind the scenes to push them to the forward, to let people show them, because we were going to be leaving eventually, and it was to be their church. And it's interesting because the way they did church for the first, my goodness, probably the first year and a half, most of the time that they were together, it was very heavy emphasis on playing some games, other things. And after about 6 months, I met Valera, the pastor, and I said, Valera, you know, you spend maybe about 30 minutes in actually teaching the word and going through scripture, and then you may spend an hour or 2 hours in games. I said, I'm just curious, what's your rationale for this? Why are you doing this? And his comment was, Chris, he said, they are terrified of us. Their whole life they've been told there's no God. They've been told that Baptists were evil people who ate their children and, you know, did all kinds of evil things. And they're terrified of us. And so this is just ice breaking. This is to let them know that we're real people, that we're just like they are, and that, you know, we have families and that we love each other and that, you know, we want to spend that time. Perfect sense. I, as a hearing person, would have never thought to have approached it that way. But Valera, knowing his people, his culture, the way that they did things, and know that time that it took to build up, to grow that trust and respect. And so today, they don't play any games. I mean, they're there for probably 2 hours, and it's all teaching. They have multiple pastors preaching, et cetera, et cetera. And so it's just interesting how that started. 2013, there are now 3 deaf churches in the city of Moscow, 1 mission church, and there's currently probably about 200 total who are attending. And it's interesting to see because about 2010, 2009, I had to meet with the Starshi presbyter. He's the pastor who's over all the churches. They choose a person for about every 2 years. It's interesting, the churches all choose the one hearing pastor who will be over the churches and make sure that everything is okay and doctrinally everything is going well. I met with him about 2010, 2009, and he said, Chris, he said, I don't know whether I should even allow the deaf to have a church. He said, I don't know what they're saying. I can't communicate with them. I can't teach them anything. I can't tell whether they're teaching truth or heresy. I can't really relate with them. And after he rambled off about 7 of those things, I said, well, Pastor, why would you allow your inabilities from letting them to grow in God when they can teach each other, they can reach each other, they can tell when they're teaching truth or falsehoods? And it was just kind of a wall that hit him. He's like, I never thought about that. See, we've got a reverse handicap here, is that you've got a hearing person who has no idea anything about the deaf people telling deaf people you can't do this. And so anyway, it's interesting because today, in 2012, that same Starship Presbyter, he asked Valera to be one of the 2 pastors who actually baptized during the joint baptism service in the summertime. And so, and they're also, the Baptist pastors are recognizing that the group are one of the largest and fastest growing people in the churches when they have a deaf church. And there have been at least 2 pastors, 2 Starship Presbyters in 2 different cities who've said, we need to meet the deaf people and find out what they're doing because they're growing and we're not. And so that's what's been happening with that. So why going from 0 to 300 and then 300 to 30, why what are some of the problems that we're seeing with that? Again, is this whole structure of who the deaf people are. Most of the churches are focusing on this aspect right here. There's no cultural aspect of trying to reach the deaf people. When deaf people coming into the church in Moscow, they were told, you shouldn't dress that way. You need to change your dress if you're going to come to church and dress appropriately, whether they were Christians or non-Christians. When the deaf people had a question and they didn't understand the interpreter, they would look at each other and try to, ask, what did she say? What did she mean? And they were being told, shh, you don't talk in church. You can't do that. When decisions were to be made, they were told, don't worry, we'll take care of it for you. We know how to do this. It's interesting, that same church, they were celebrating their 10th anniversary fairly soon after we got there. And it was interesting because I was asking the deaf people, what are you going to do on that day? What are the plans? Well, we don't know. This is your 10th anniversary and you don't know what's happening? Hearing people are taking care of it. I'm like, but this is your 10th anniversary as a deaf interpretive ministry. Do you not have a part of that? No, they told us not to worry about it, that they would take care of everything. And so this whole thing, we're doing a very huge disservice of ignoring the core deaf group. And so it's culturally irrelevant. The language, in Russia, the way they were doing it is, we don't have a deaf ministry, we're going to start one. You are going to be the interpreter, start learning sign language, and in 2 months you're going to start interpreting. Seriously, that's about the way it went. If you've been in any foreign language class, how much can you really speak after 2 months? But that's the way it was begun. So anyway, that's what's happened. The other thing that I really want to stress for you as ministers and future ministers, pastors, we've got to be careful that we don't look at deaf people as objects of ministry. We shouldn't be looking at anyone as an object of ministry. And that's what's happening, not only in Russia, but it happens in our United States as well, is that we look at them and we're like, oh, our deaf people. Isn't that just so beautiful? Oh, we just love that language. And so we have this benevolent attitude towards our deaf people, and it's really doing a disservice. We really need to look at as being partners in ministry. How many of you either are in a church that has a deaf ministry or has had a deaf ministry? Okay, we had a question for you. Okay. Any of your churches have a black ministry? I think a lot of people would find that very offensive. We have a black person in our church. It's just so, see them worship. But is that not the same thing that we're doing? Or, our Hispanic ministry. Oh, it's just so, sweet to see them and how they... If we're looking at people as a people group, then we need to stop thinking of deaf people as the handicap who can't do for themselves. And we need to allow them to do for themselves and to be partners in ministry. I've never seen, in my 29 years of full-time ministry, I've never seen a church that has really effectively blended the two together where they were truly equal in working. It's always, deaf people are passive participants in ministry. I got to close out, but Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 9:22, he says, to the Jew I became as a Jew, to the non-Jew I became as a non-Jew, to the slave I became as a slave, and to the free man I became as a free man. Why? So that he could reach a few. I've become all things to all people so that by all means possible I can reach a few. As ministers, we have a responsibility. If we're going to reach our community, there's nothing wrong with an interpretive ministry. Don't hear me saying that. But if we're going to truly effectively reach our communities for Christ in the deaf world, we really have to have this overall picture of how we're going to reach the whole person and not just this one tiny aspect of just, we're providing you an interpreter. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris, for sharing your perspective and your wisdom related to the deaf ministry. I really appreciate that. I hope that really helps us. I hope that it will in the future. I wanted to summarize a little bit by saying that there are some challenges and some opportunities for us in our churches. The challenge is what? Is if you're going to find the deaf, to see the deaf, you're going to have to go find them. You'd have to invite them into our churches, right? But the problem that you encounter first is not only the language, but you also have the cultural sensitivity. You'd need to have that. You need to have resources. Perhaps they're not available for them, you know. Maybe they can't go to Christian counseling, you know. Maybe they don't have Christian counselors for the deaf out there for you. But there are ministry opportunities. There are a few out there. And there are some resources that are available. And also having access to Bibles in their own language. But, you know, today we have made improvements in all those things. And so there's a deaf missions opportunity as well. There's also interpretive films where you can see, like it's the Bible in the video, you can see an interpreter sometimes, you'll see that. But they don't have it for all the languages yet, in all the countries, for the deaf. So what are some opportunities in our churches to really get involved with deaf ministry? For one thing, I think Chris emphasized it, is partnership. Partnership. Partnering with deaf people who have a heart for the gospel, that want to reach the gospel as missionaries. Maybe they've been called to be pastors. You want to partner with them, you know, help them with their needs and to see how you can best fit in with their culture and their language. Also, the relationship is what's important. Developing relationships with deaf people. Yourselves. I always find it interesting. I always feel like when I go into a new place, when people realize that I'm deaf, they become so terrified. Like, what do I do? They panic, they freak out, I don't know what to do. And I'm like, hey, you know, guys, I am just like you. I'm just like you. I'm probably a little bit more frightened of you because you're frightened of me now. So now we're all scared. We scare each other. So just be yourself. Just be yourself. Often you'll find deaf people, as you're trying to communicate with him, and it feels a little bit awkward, you know what to do, maybe you don't understand or something like that, they often are going to provide a way for you so that you can communicate with them. They're very good at that. Maybe it's through texting, maybe it's through paper, maybe it's through different, you know, they're used to doing that. They're deaf people. You know, I'm deaf myself. You know, we have relationships too. So develop a relationship. You never know what might happen, where that relationship might lead, or it may lead them to Christ. You don't know. Maybe you're the first person who ever has loved them, truly. The only hearing person who's ever taken a notice and said, you're a person of value, you're a person of worth, and I value you because God loves you, and I love you too, and I want you to know Jesus Christ. Also, you can empower deaf people. Because sometimes I think they can't do things. Sometimes I think, well, you know, I can't find a job. Yes, you can. Of course you can. And I'll help you. Maybe, I'll keep my ear out for a job, and I'll keep something out, and maybe I'll provide that for them. But you can give them those opportunities to help empower them. Or they'll say, well, you know, I have no church. So maybe, you know, there's a few deaf people, and you can provide an opportunity, maybe a facility for them to meet. And maybe your facility can have a place for deaf people to come meet together. Or maybe you can just be an advocate for them and get involved in advocacy. You know, our deaf identities are colored by a history of oppression, where hearing people have kind of oppressed us and been like, oh, you're deaf, you can't work. Because you can't talk, you can't do X, Y, and Z. Oh, okay. That's not true, right? But we have been limited in the past. And often we get a label, you know, oppression. You know, you won't find it in the dictionary. It's called oralism. It's a label for that. Oralism. It's not autism, let me be clear. Excuse me, it's autism, excuse me. Autism. It's a word, it's like racism. But autism is oppression through, hearing. It's like an oral method. If you can't hear, then you can't do whatever. So it's that same idea. So as if you're black, you can't do this. If you're a woman, you can't do this. If you're deaf, you can't do this. You can't. And that needs to be changed to can. Because you saw that on the video. You can. You know? Did you see that through that video? The success? And that needs to happen in all of us. Sometimes the government, they will oppress people. And communities won't have a voice. Whole people groups won't have voices. So anyway, just in summary, the last goal, the last comment that one goal that should be a goal for all of us is that we want to make disciples, right? And that's the goal for the deaf community too, and the deaf church is to make deaf disciples. We have the same mission, the same goals. We also have the same God. You as a church, you know, you're important to the world and to the deaf community. And what you meet and how you minister as a deaf person, it's a global mission. It's a global mission to contact the world, the deaf in the world. In Isaiah 29 it says, and on that day, the deaf will hear. And do you see how I say hear? How I've got my thumb near my eye? That word, it says, and out of their darkness, the eyes of the blind will see, and their hearts will see. Do you see how I did blindness from my heart? That's prophetic, and that's not been satisfied yet. That's not come to fruition. And it's definitely not in the definition, and that's where we're trying to go to. We're trying to bring that prophecy to fulfillment for the coming of Christ. My question for you is, and I want you to think about this today, if you meet a deaf person, what are you going to do?
Okay, this has been great, and we do have time for questions. I would love for you to be able to ask some questions for Bruce. So, anyone?
So you mentioned differences in language in different countries for signing as well. How is that? Because I was under the impression that ASL is fairly widespread, not just in America. So how do you navigate the language difference?
Okay, well, with the ASL language, the way it was developed, you have to understand that the language itself was set up, it was from French Sign Language, actually. It's from FSL. There was a man who came here from France, and he set up the very first school for the deaf, and that man's name was Thomas Leclerc, and his son, Howard Gallaudet, it was the first president of Gallaudet University. So Gallaudet, who was it, Leclerc and Gallaudet? Oh no, there was another man named Leclerc as well. Leclerc and then Leclerc were both of the names. But those two men, they were from France, and they came over to the U.S. So the reason why they went to France is because they wanted to know how to teach deaf children the gospel. They wanted to know how to teach the gospel. So they went and found a deaf man, and they found these two deaf men. They were willing to come over and set up a school, Gallaudet University. It was very interesting. It was the very first. They were the one that did the handshapes for
on their seal.
on the seal.
And it says Epapha
Oh,
on the
yeah.
seal.
Yeah. And it means open. So they were very motivated to go through education to spread the gospel message. And now we just see the opposite, don't we, today, in the world? So before it was about education, and now education's not involved. I mean, now the ministry is not involved in education as well. So anyway, did that answer your question?
Well, you mentioned, if you go to another country, you may have have a hard time communicating.
Sign language is not universal,
Okay.
but there's some aspects to it that have some shared similarities.
Okay.
There's a part of sign language that you don't have in a spoken language, and that's the iconic. This is tree here, it's tree in Russia, it's tree, it takes on the shape. And so there's some of that that allows you to communicate in other languages. And so a deaf person from one language to another language can typically begin conversing, but they're not speaking necessarily each other's language.
Okay.
And also, like drink, for example. Drink, if I say, do you want something to drink? Everybody knows what I'm saying, right? If I do this, if I make this sign. So there are some gestures that will be similar as well. But, can you show some different signs that are,
Different. In Russia, in American Sign Language, this is sorry. But in Russian, this is anger. And so in in Russia, they'll ask you if you like this. You know, in American Sign Language, this is devil, this is Satan. But in Russia, this is oatmeal. And so, you know, if you like oatmeal, I'm like, no, I don't like oatmeal.
Any other questions? Okay.
So, as we go into church ministry and we go to a church that doesn't have any way to reach those who would be deaf, what are the first steps that we should take as pastors who want to be involved in reaching the deaf community, but we don't know how?
I'm gonna let Chris answer that one too.
I think he's putting this because I began 2 deaf churches in the States and then one in Moscow and then the others in Moscow. What, as a hearing person, what I see is one, if you've got deaf people in your area, go ahead and be open. If you have an interpreter, go ahead and do that. But the very important thing that we have to remember, that should not be our end goal. Our end goal should be to reach our community for Christ. And for that to be effective, that needs to change. You need to empower that deaf person to be the one that's making decisions in that group, not the interpreter. Oftentimes in our churches, the interpreter becomes the gatekeeper to prevent things from progressing. It's happened to me in 2 churches. Well, in the first church that we began in El Paso, the interpreters had great hearts. They were very, I think mercy was their gift, and they wanted to do everything for the deaf. And when we came in there and changed it from an interpretive ministry to a church, it was very difficult. And we had a 2-year struggle with those interpreters who just didn't want to give up their position of power. And so, as pastors, we need to set is, you're the interpreter, this is who we're trying to reach, and this is who I'm going to be speaking to. And so don't allow your interpreters to become the directors of the ministry. That happened in the 70s and 80s. The interpreter always typically was the director, and whatever they said was gospel. And so empower your deaf people to make the decisions. 2, it's not realistic that every church is going to have a deaf church in there. If it can, great, allow them to do that. Dr. Criswell is who I grew up under, and the church, the ministry to the deaf there began in 1918. And so when I became the pastor of the deaf congregation there in 1995, we were averaging 129 people on a Sunday. That wasn't its height, but that's where we were. Dr. Criswell's philosophy was the deaf people know how to best to reach the deaf people, leave them alone and let them reach the people. And so in that situation, it was very empowering to the deaf people. They had their own budget, they had their own checking account, they took care of things themselves. And so they were empowered, they had control, it was their ownership, their ministry. Oftentimes in interpretive ministries, if you only have 1 or 2 people, that's not very realistic, but still make sure that you respect the individual. When you're talking to them, talk directly to them, not through the interpreter. Tell him, tell her that we can't, talk directly to the people. Those are just a few hints. And I think there's a piece of paper that talks about some do's and don'ts with deaf people. That's kind of a first step. But as an association of churches, you can still bring that to the forefront as, are we reaching our community? Every time I see an interpretive ministry, you're talking about maybe 5 to 10 people. When that becomes a deaf church, you're typically talking a minimum of 30 people and up as far as who's going to be reached through the ministry.
Okay, one more question? Okay.
How many deaf ministries and or deaf churches in Alabama? Do you have any idea?
Deaf churches, like their own church, there's 3 as far as I know. I think there's just 3. I'm not exactly sure of that number. One is here in Birmingham, one is in Mobile, or, Montgomery, and one is in Oxford, Deaf churches specifically, but ministries I'm not exactly sure. Maybe 10 or 15? I don't know. I'm just like, well,
Different denominations, I don't have those counts.
maybe I've missed. I would say probably about 15. You'll find that the deaf churches often, they're involved under a larger hearing church.
Here in larger urban.
They're going to be in the urban areas, not in the rural areas.
In Shelby County, in Jefferson County, there's a total of 5,000 deaf people who would be considered that core group of people. And probably on any given Sunday, we're reaching I would say less than 100, maybe 150 if I'm being overly optimistic.
Okay, thank you so much, Bruce. Thank you also, Chris, for coming. Please show them your appreciation. All right. All right.
Thank you.
And we
Wait,
can
can I
also
make one more
remember.
comment?
We can also remember that while we are here and while Bruce is here, he is also a resource for us continually. What a great resource to have here at Beeson for any questions you may have in the future. Thank you very much.